Greetings, everybody. I'm Scott Rodell here at the Great River Taoist Center, which is home to our Academy of Chinese Swordsmanship. This is episode 3, and our look at this Imjin duel, a crossing of blades between a Chinese Jian and a Japanese samurai, and looking at what would have happened during that kind of encounter. We're going to look at the weaponry that was carried by the Ming army. During that period, the Ming had very good armor, lamellar armor for the higher officers. They would have had helmets very much like this. These two helmets probably date from an earlier period, probably the Yuan period. They were collected in Tibet, but they're very similar. There's no significant difference between those earlier helmets and the Ming. They're made of multiple plates. You can see this one has 8 plates that go around. Every other plate has a plate with a ridge on it. Same kind of thing here. Helmets like this, swords just bounce right off of them. So it's a good sturdy helmet. All soldiers would have had this. The ones in heavier armor, of course, but also those soldiers who wore the brigandine armor. Chinese called it Jian, nail armor. That armor was composed of plates, metal plates, that were riveted to a cloth front. So the front of the armor was cloth, back of the armor had these plates. It's very flexible, works well for the soldier, but it's also a really good type of armor because it's relatively inexpensive to make. So that allowed the Ming soldiers to be, well armored for going into the field for a serious battle. The troops from southern China, however, didn't wear so much armor. They were used to fighting in a much hotter climate. So they mostly used tongue pie, rattan shields, along with a saber. And they would have had greaves to protect their lower part of their legs. But when you get men together with their shields like that, of course, the shield really protects a lot of the body. It's a lot cooler than wearing armor. And of course, the padding you have to wear under your armor to absorb the impact. So the southern soldiers really preferred shield and saber, as opposed to the northern troops which had the lamellar armor or the dingjia armor, depending on their rank. They also had all kinds of other weapons. They wielded spears. They also had matchlocks. This particular matchlock, this one is from the Qing period. Very few, of course, have survived more than 400 years from the Ming dynasty, but it's very similar. The stock was a bit different during the Ming, but overall it's the same, very simple serpentine lock. Just there was a match here, fuse, you opened up, powder's in there, of course, boom, powders went. So there are a large number of these used during the Ming dynasty. As I said, though, basically the same, very simple mechanism used through the Qing period. This one is, of course, Qing. The Chinese also had heavy cavalry. I mentioned soldiers who had lamellar armor. They had heavy cavalry that could withstand the fire from the Japanese matchlocks. And that was very important in battles where the heavy cavalry could just ride right into battle. The bullets didn't penetrate their armor. And of course, that made a big difference in battles where they could employ those heavy cavalry. But by far the most important, most decisive weapon that the Ming brought with them were their cannons. And for example, at the Battle of Pyongyang, you can see the Japanese had their arabesques, their matchlocks. They had achieved very high rates of fire with them. It was very useful for the Japanese who were on the march constantly, really achieved very fast rates of march, in large part because they could carry their weaponry. They didn't have to haul cannons that would really slow them down. They'd need the animals and all that to take those big, heavy cannons with them. So that was really good as they were conquering Korea. On the other side, though, when the Chinese came in with their cannons had a obviously much more devastating impact, right? You're shooting big cannonballs, really much more powerful weapon, and also, more importantly, also a greater range. So Battle of Pyongyang, when the Chinese got there, they drove the Japanese out very quickly. In fact, the Japanese only escaped at night because the river was frozen, because they just couldn't match the distance. The cannons are hitting you from much further away. The matchlocks couldn't do anything about it. But for our concerns, what we really want to look at are the swords, because this is really about the duel between the Jian, a Chinese officer in the Ming army who would have had a Jian. I'll be wielding a Jian in our duels, and a samurai officer, mid-level ranks officer, who of course would have had a katana. So let's take a look at Ming Dynasty sabers, Ming Chinese Dynasty Dao. Now, most people, I think, are familiar with oxtail Dao. This is probably a type of Dao that everybody's seen it in Kung Fu movies. I think most people practicing Chinese martial arts today tend to practice with these. It has this marked widening toward the tip. The thing about these oxtail Dao is they didn't really appear in China until probably about 1800. Nobody knows exactly when. And they didn't really see them in big numbers until really the middle of the 19th century. And also, the oxtail Dao, this New Wei Dao, was only ever a civilian weapon. This was a non-pattern weapon, not a military one. So you see a lot of variety in how much they widen, their lengths, the curvatures, all those kinds of things. But needless to say, obviously, generally much wider than you can see these Ming swords are, and they handle quite differently. So just for comparison, I wanted to show you that really quickly. Typical New Wei Dao, the type of saber, that Chinese saber that most people are familiar with, but one that was not at all used, didn't even exist during the Ming Dynasty. Ming swords of this later period basically fell into two categories. The willow leaf, here's a really beautiful old example. This one is 28 3/4 inches long. It's probably about average length. It is at 73 centimeters. The willow leaf is one that's gently curving, and it's defined by the fact that you can't quite deliver a thrust with it. It curves enough that you just can't deliver a thrust. You can use a jaw, but with a thrust, it's like thrust this way, it's going to tend to slip off. This one is very gently curved. They often are, more or less this kind of curvature. Now, of course, not all the same. Sometimes it might be just a little bit more curved than this. But this is a pretty typical example. And it's nice because unlike what I like about it, especially coming from, I like to really play with my Jian, like to wield the Jian a lot. Of course, I also practice with Dao, but they're a little bit faster, a little bit more maneuverable than the sort of later oxtail is. So it's a faster blade. I would say it's one that affords you for a little better accuracy because of that. Not that the other weapon's necessarily inaccurate, but a heavier blade with that bulging, with that widening tip, that oxtail shape, tends to pull into the cut more. These don't. You can really slash well with a sword like this, as well as deliver a nice solid cut with them. So this is your Liu Yue Dao or willow leaf type of saber. The other type is the goose quill. Goose quill is relatively, looks very similar. I think maybe a quick look, they won't look so different in profile, but there is a difference. If I give a thrust here, that tip is just far enough down that I don't have to bring my wrist down to try to get the tip in line. It'd be hard to deliver a thrust with your wrist so bent like that, would really go against your wrist. So the goose quill is kind of you could say a hybrid. It's straight enough that I can use Jian type techniques. So I tend to like it. If somebody's coming in, you want to cut from underneath the tiao, I can thrust in with it. I can use a back edge kind of hit, boom, like it's a G cut. So pretty much all of the Jianfa techniques, anything I might do with my Jian, you can pretty much do with one of these goose quill sabers, a Yanmao Dao. What's a little different about it, of course, is since it doesn't bevel both sides like a Jian, the back is squared, it does have a little more oomph to it. So it's kind of like, a Jian, boom, on steroids, if you will. It's a little more powerful, got a little bit more weight. So in that cut, when it comes around, boom, you're going to be able to give a more powerful cut than you would with the Jian. But still has that, say, versatility, ability to use the tip, the point, the way a Jian does. This particular example, this goose quill has really nice fullering on it. It has this intermittent fuller with a sort of U-turn around here at the base. This particular style of fullering is something that apparently was a motif that we saw on Mogul sabers and was imported into China. This example is 72 centimeters long, so it's 20 inches. So it's about as long as most sabers tend to be. So good sword, you can definitely reach out and touch somebody with it. I want you to notice one more detail before I show you the next sword, and that is all goose quill are double-edged. By definition, a goose quill should be double-edged at the tip. And it's usually about 4 to 6 inches, usually more 4, but in that range. This one, it's beveled out. So it's formed, the double edge is formed by kind of scooping away on each side a little bit to form a bevel right in there to make it to form that double-edged. That happened a little bit later. If we look at this third example here, here's another example of what I would still call a goose quill. As far as its form, its shape, how I would wield it, it's a goose quill. Many people refer to this, and it's a correct name, as a yutodao, a fish head saber. And that's because of that shape, obviously the shape of the tip here. So this is, very commonly, people refer to this as yutodao. I find it an interesting shape, kind of pleasing to the eye. So I quite like the yutodao. Problem with the yutodao, reason why you don't see them so much is this sort of yelman, another Central Asian kind of feature like that fullering that was Chinese adopted for their sabers. That raised peak here created a stress point and a stress riser, and they would break. So earlier Ming swords you'll see this, but was basically most say was abandoned in favor of just beveling straight down on the blade rather than raising it. Generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the yutodao, I would say this yutodao variant of a goose quill is, if you see that peak, it's might be an earlier one. Not always, but it's an indication that it could be. But if you look at this sword, it's really straight, right? Compared to even these two, especially that willow leaf, it's straight enough that very easily can give a thrust. You can thrust up, thrust down. I can thrust straight in. That tip is going to bite and go in. Not a particularly long one, this one. This yutodao is 63 centimeters or 24 3/4 inches. So, I might not quite call this a duandao. Somebody might sort of like, it's kind of on the border of what I might consider a duandao versus a full duandao, short dao. I might say cutlass if you like. A shorter dao like this versus a long one. But the weight and feel of it is really, it's not like it's a little sword. It's got that power. It makes it feel like, yeah, I can really give a nice, robust cut with this. So it feels like a full-size sword. So I wouldn't personally call this a duandao, although by length, somebody else might. And I also think that this length of sword, if I'm in close, maybe especially if I have a tongue pie and I have to fight in close, get in here like this, come whoop, and it's really in close with your duifang, I think a little bit shorter blade is often a better choice, right? Especially when you've got a lot of men around you, you can't move well. I don't want to bang into my comrades. If I come here, I don't want to, go over there. I want to keep it nice and tight and come back in. I think a blade like this, maybe 65 to just a little 68 centimeters, something like that, probably is more functional when you're packed in tight. So, I wouldn't say, this is just something for everyday carry. It might have been, but I think it also could very well have seen action, say, during the Imjin War. So really, really functional, solid blade. This one is not from the Ming Dynasty. I thought it was when I originally acquired it, but the polisher looked at it, and the only way you can really accurately say whether a sword is of the Ming period or any period is to examine the tang. And you look at the coloration of that and how, what color is that patina. Now, it's always good to get a swordsmith's opinion about that, a professional smith, not a swordsmith, a sword polisher's opinion about that. Swordsmith might know as well, but sword polisher who's seen a lot of tang and can examine them and looks at swords that have been dated, so he knows, okay, this is from that period. What is that color? It's obviously somewhat artistic way of saying it because it's slight coloration differences, but it does give you some idea. And this particular one, although it is absolutely of a Ming style, is of the Qing period, of early Qing, but still Qing. Why did I think it was Ming? Well, because there are other examples that are known to be Ming that are basically exactly the same. There's one in the Met's collection in New York City that is basically the same blade. And it's the same sword, same style of fitting. So when you see that kind of thing, one thing that tells us is that throughout Chinese history, they made swords in large numbers. So that was maybe a model that one forge made, and they made hundreds of them. Maybe they made thousands of them over the years, especially during a period of war. They made the same model over and over again. Right? Also, sometimes there were swords that were a well-known sword. Maybe it was carried by somebody that was important. Maybe it was somebody the emperor gifted to somebody, and those swords get reproduced. So you see, if you see a lot of swords, you do now and then come across ones that, oh, these two are almost exactly the same because they were produced in large numbers. Okay. Now look at this one here. Now that's first of all, that's straight, right? That is no question you're going to give a thrust with that. No problem at all. Coming in, boom, nice and straight for a thrust. You'll notice that it is double-edged. This is a goose quill. It is double-edged here, but it is not the yuto, with the raised peak way. It is this where it's beveled out at the tip to make that double-edged bit at the thing. And that is, I'd say, about 5 inches long. But you can also see this is a really robust blade. It's 900 grams, 2 pounds. Handling this sword, I've done a lot of cutting practice in my life. And handling this sword, I can tell you without question, this would take off a limb really easily. Whereas these swords, you could argue, and I say no question that these were heavier earlier in life. These are a little bit more, you might say, toward the dueling side. They're lighter and faster, right? This is a really robust, solid cutter. There's no question to me that this is a military sword. Even just holding it in my hand, it has a monstrous kind of feeling to it. And 2 pounds, it's heavy. You hit somebody in armor, they're still going to feel it when you come through with that cut. When you hit down into the floating rib, everybody's going to feel that. Because it's so heavy, and you see how thick the back is, it's like a 1/4 inch here at the base, really thick spine. Because it's so heavy, 2 pounds, 900 grams, it's not that long. It's 68 centimeters, it's 26 3/4. When a sword is of this weight, at 28, 2 pounds, if it's 28, 29 inches long, it's going to tire your arm really quickly. You're coming in and you hit this one and boom in, and in the battle, it just wears you out too quickly. So you've got to have a little bit shorter sword, in this case, saber. But very clearly, again, I can still use a tiao with it. I can still come up with a thrust with it. I can still use a G hit with the back edge. I still can use all of the techniques that I would employ in Jianfa. I can do with this Dao. Not quite as quickly because it's really kind of a heavy blade, but I can definitely employ them. So those are our two categories and some really, I think, beautiful examples of Chinese sabers. During the late Ming, there was also a resurgence of long two-handed swords, both Dao and Jian. Most people know the long sabers, the two-handed sabers, by the term Miao Dao these days. That's become the most common term for them. But that's a term that doesn't seem to have appeared until the Republic, until the Chinese Republic period. During the Ming Dynasty, those long two-handed sabers were generally referred to as Dan Dao. The very well-known manual, the Dan Dao Fashuan, records the techniques for the long saber, the two-handed saber. They were also called Qiang Dao, long saber, Shuang So Dao, paired hand or two-handed saber. During the Ming, probably most common term was Dan Dao. But again, unfortunately, I do not have a period example that I can show you. But if you look back at our various videos we've done in the past, you'll see examples of how they were used in combat, basic stances, and so on. So please have a look at those. In our next video, we're going to look at the Jian of the Ming period. We're going to look at both the two-handed Jian and the single-handed Jian, and I have a nice antique examples to show you. So until next time, if you enjoyed this video, you found it interesting, please do subscribe and hit that bell so you get the notices. Stay strong. 再见.